So I just read Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. I just have to say I love the cover of this book. The Mervyn O'Gorman series of photographs of Christina Bevan. Just beautiful, beautiful photography. I'm always struck by how sort of modern they look. Like it looks like a portrait of a girl from the 1970s. But these were taken in the 1910s. Just the color, it always blows me away. Anyways, that's just the cover. So this book is sort of a love triangle between three young people in Britain in the 80s and 90s who, just to straight up spoil it, they never really managed to work everything out in time and never managed to sort of find that love and experience that love with each other while they're still able to do so. The book is written from the perspective of a person at the end of their life, looking back and describing the events from their childhood onward about themselves, their best friend, and this boy that they have been in love with. Now, the love is never really explicitly said on their part. They're not pining after this boy the whole time, but as a reader, you can really tell that they develop feelings for this boy, and more clearly that the boy has developed feelings for them. There's also a sort of a mystery element to it, a speculative fiction world building thing that is hinted at. You recognize that there's something else going on right from the beginning of the novel, but it's never fully explained until right at the very end. So that's kind of, I would call that the subplot. It's not the main plot of the novel. The novel is not about this, but it is there, and you are waiting for it, and kind of it hovers into view. You sort of, as the reader, you pick up enough on it to sort of figure out where it's going, but it's not the main plot at all. The main plot is the relationships between these three people. So our sort of main character, the one whose POV we are getting, the one explaining the story, is Kathy. Now, I found Kathy's way of explaining the story kind of not hard to follow, but she tells it as if she's telling an oral story where she jumps back and forth and digresses down tangents, and then, which reminds her of one thing, and then she runs with that for a bit, but then she gets back to her original point. And it kind of has the narrative jumping around a bit, which didn't feel as straightforward as if it was like in a journal format, or if we were in a third person just following these events chronologically. I guess it kind of gave it flavor, but I didn't find it that special. Kathy's best friend is this girl, Ruth, who is... I did not like Ruth at all. She seemed to me like a horrible person. She's the one that would sort of lie or exaggerate or tell lots of white lies, mostly, not outright lie, although she does that as well to sort of gain social status. And she's a very strong personality, very extroverted, trying to fit in or be the one to sort of run sort of cohort or group, social group that she's in. And then there's Tommy, who is the boy. When we're first introduced to him when they're sort of preteens or in their early teens, he seems to be like the problem one. He's a bit of an outcast. He's got a temper. He's really bad at art. So they're at this boarding school, this very sort of upper class boarding school where they all practice art and poetry and whatnot. And he doesn't seem to be able to hack it. He doesn't have that special something or whatever, and gets mocked for it. And so he just, again, loses his temper. But we see him mature and grow over time. And like I said, it's not long before we see Tommy starting to sort of show interest in Kathy. But it's kind of subtle, and Kathy doesn't really pick up on it. Or if she does, she sort of assumes that the reader is also assuming that this is happening. So it doesn't sort of explicit say, like, this is when Tommy fell in love with me. But you get the sense throughout reading this whole book that Tommy and Kathy are meant for each other. But of course, Tommy ends up with Ruth when they're teenagers and stays with Ruth throughout sort of young adulthood. Now, the sort of speculative fiction, I wouldn't go as far to say sci-fi element to the book, but this sort of whole mystery behind this novel that we get bits and pieces of, but like I said, you can sort of quickly pick up on what's happening, is that all three of the people in this book, and in fact everyone at this school, Hailsham, that they go to, this sort of boarding school that they live at, they're all clones. So in this world in the 1950s and 60s post-war, the cloning technology had taken off, and these people from Hailsham are clones, and they're being raised with the idea that at some point they're going to give donations. And by donations, it means donating their organs. So they are clones created as a sort of a future store of organs for the non-clones, which could be really dark and dystopian, but it's not presented in that light. Because remember, it's through the eyes of one of these clones, Kathy, who she is being raised in this world. She's been sort of indoctrinated, I guess, is a strong word, but I think it fits into believing herself to be this clone, that when she's grown up, she's going to give donations. She's going to have her organs harvested and then eventually pass away. at a young age. And so that sort of puts a timer on the book, where these people are trying to live as much of their lives as possible, knowing that they're going to pass away in their late 20s or mid to late 20s, or maybe even early 30s. They don't put a date or a time on it, but Kathy's writing this when she's 31, and she hasn't gotten to the point in her life where she's giving donations. She hasn't become a donor yet. She's a carer, someone who looks after the clones who are giving donations. And at this point, Tommy and Ruth have already died from their donations. So these people really have a short lifespan, which to us with our much longer lifespan, it seems quite tragic, but I don't think that really makes much of a difference. Like putting a date of, say, 30 versus to us having a date of 80 or 90, we still know that the end is coming for all of us. And we need to sort of make the choices and sort of seize the day and live in the moment and do what we can while we're here, because, you know, when we get to in our 70s and our 80s, we're going to start breaking down and falling apart and dying. And of course, tragedies can happen before then. But in this novel, that sort of 80 is being pushed back to 25, 30. And I think through that lens, it doesn't seem so shocking, because like I said, these people are growing up in this world expecting that this is going to happen. So they sort of know their end date, much the same way that we know our end date as being 80 or whatever. But it makes it all the more tragic, this love triangle between Ruth, Kathy, and Tommy. So they grow up in this boarding school. They're being taught sort of the classics and literature and art and poetry and music and all of these very cultured things. And there's this mysterious woman, the Madame, they call her, or they just call her Madame, or the Madame, I guess. She's from Belgium, she's French, who will come to the school once in a while and collect some of their art. The very best pieces of their art will be sort of put up, and she will come and take it for her. They call her gallery, and they're sort of questioning, why is she doing this? What's the purpose of this gallery? And the Madame seems very sort of scared of these students in the way that one would be scared of sort of a spider or something. She's kind of revolting or repulsed by these children, which is of course because they're clones, but they don't see themselves as clones. They're to them, they're just people. And at their school, they have these teachers called their guardians, who are the ones that are looking after them and raising them. And they sort of go through normal school things like young British wealthy school children go through. They grow up, they fall in love, they experience sex, which they can't reproduce, by the way, because they're clones. So it's kind of a free-for-all in that regard. And then once they get around the age of 16, sort of when you'd finish your GCSEs in England, they sort of graduate and they go off to what they call the cottages, which they're leaving Hailsham. They're going to, it's sort of this farm place where they live in a barn in pretty squalid conditions, but they don't really recognize it as that. But a group of these graduates, they call them veterans, are staying there. They're working on these essays, kind of like a final thesis, something similar to A-levels, or maybe even bachelor degrees. And when they either finish the essays or whenever they're ready, they will go off to become carers. And that's what happens. So this trio, along with some others from Hailsham, leave and go to this cottage. Reminder that Tommy and Ruth have been in a relationship this whole time. They meet some of the veterans, and of course Ruth tries to ingratiate herself with this new crew and starts picking up their mannerisms and tries to act more mature and fit in. And this is when we start hearing the rumor about these deferrals, where if you can prove to Hailsham, which seems to be a special place even in the world of clones, because not everyone at this cottage is from Hailsham. Hailsham is special in that if you can prove that you're in a relationship with someone and you love them, and you can prove that your love is real, then they will sort of defer your donations a few years, so you can sort of live with each other and be in love and have a sort of a life. And the veterans there are sort of questioning whether this is true. Have they heard of this? And of course, the people from Hailsham haven't, but Ruth sort of makes it out like they do. And there are other moments where the person they've been modeled off of, the person that they are a clone of, they call their possible. So it's like a possible version of themselves. And they think they find the possible of Ruth. They go off to visit her or find her, and they find this later. And at first they're like, it really does look like Ruth. But then after spending some time sort of following this woman around, they realize Ruth is not the clone of this person. And that sort of makes them feel a bit dejected. And then Ruth sort of has a big meltdown and claims that the only people that they would clone are the sort of junkies and prostitutes and the sort of untouchables of society. This makes Tommy think of a time when he ran into Kathy, who had been flipping through a bunch of pornography magazines, and Kathy played it off like, yeah, I'm just, doing it for kicks. Hey, you want to check some out too? But he could tell from the way she was flipping through them really fast and just looking at the faces that she was sort of expecting to find the person the person she was a clone of in one of these sort of porn stars. Why did Kathy sort of have this opinion of herself? Well, it was because of these sort of sexual urges that she's felt. And she talked a bit to Ruth about these, but Ruth denied ever having similar things. And so Kathy sort of thought there was something wrong with her, and she must have sort of been a clone of a porn star. Because why does she have this intense urge or need for sex at times, which turns out is just a totally normal human thing. And at the end, Ruth admits like she has the same feelings, but that's what Kathy thought of herself. So because of Ruth acting like this and other reasons, Kathy's just sort of, she's matured enough that she's sort of past Ruth's sort of childishness and eventually just up and leaves and says, you know what, I'm going to be a carer now, I'm done. So the whole idea of carers seems strange to me. If you live in this world where you're cloning people and those clones you're using, I'm going to spoil the whole book, but the clones are not considered human. They're not treated with human rights or human dignity. They do not have rights. And so why do we have a need for carers, people to look after these clones after they go through their various donations, like donating organs and whatnot? That part didn't make sense to me, but it's a convenient plot device that sort of keeps Kathy alive for 12 years. I think 14 years at the end of it, she was a carer for, because she was so good at it. It's not really explicitly told what she does. She's just sort of a comforter, a sort of a nurse looking after her fellow clones, which I don't know why they keep them alive at all. You'd think once they reach sort of physical maturity, just sort of kill them and put them in a freezer, or kill them and put them on sort of life support if you're just using them to harvest organs. But anyways, like I said, the sort of the whole organ donation clone thing is not the main point of this plot. It's just sort of the plot device that gets us through this love story. The main thing is it puts a time limit on love. So after being a care for a bit, because Kathy's so good at it, she starts to sort of get privilege to choose who she wants to be the carer for. And that's how she reconnects with Ruth, who is now a donor. And Ruth has seemed to mature now at this point. I mean, she's given up a few organs, so you'd hope nearing the end of her life she'd be a bit more mature. And she manages to convince them to go visit this boat. This boat has washed up nearby, and everyone's talking about it, and Ruth's really like to see it. So she asks Kathy to go see it. And of course, it just happens that this boat is washed up near where Tommy is staying as a donor at this other clinic. And so they go and grab Tommy, and then the three of them are sort of reunited. And at this point, Ruth breaks down and sort of apologizes not to Tommy, but to Kathy, and tells her, like, look, I've been standing in the way of the love between you and Tommy this whole time. Everyone has known that you've been deeply in love, and I'm sorry for that. And she says, like, look into this deferral rumor. Like, Tommy's already started donating, but if you can prove to the madame that you are in love, then maybe you can gain a few extra years. And throughout this whole book, they never once complain that they're going to die or that they don't have enough time, but they do seem to want this few extra years. And it turns out that Ruth has the address of the madame, and so he gives it to Tommy and says, like, look, when Kathy changes her mind and admits in her sort of love for you, and look up the madame and get the answers and get this deferral. And so Ruth later on passes away, or completes, as they call it, which I felt like is sort of a brain death, where the person goes totally unconscious and then they plug the body into a sort of a life support machine and keep whatever organs are left alive until they can be donated. And then Kathy decides to become the carer for Tommy, and they start this relationship, which is it's really sad, because it's the whole book you felt like these two should be together, but it's described again and again how there's something missing, how it's not like the spark is gone, but they sort of feel that moment, that time in their lives have passed, and they're sort of beyond that now, and they still have a good relationship, but it's not the sort of perfect soulmates being in love. It's just that je ne sais quoi, that missing thing that sort of shadows everything. But they decide to go find the madame, and this is near the end of the book when we finally get all of the answers, and they ask for a deferral and explain the situation in the gallery. And Tommy this whole time has been sort of practicing his art and creating these weird drawings of animals, which they even say that his drawings, now that he's started donating, his drawings are not as vibrant or as sort of good as they had been when he was in the cottages. Because remember, he was a miserable art student, but once he found out about this deferral and this belief that the gallery was a thing that the madame would use to sort of see their inner selves and see their souls, and so that's how she could judge if two people were in love based on the art they created. But anyways, he's brought this art with him. They meet the Madame, and the Madame reveals that she's just sort of a partner in the whole Hailsham business, and it's the sort of headmistress, or Miss Emily is her name, sort of one of the guardians, the sort of one running Hailsham that is also there. She's quite old now, and she explains the whole thing. It's also turned out that Hailsham is shut down, and a lot of the characters are kind of like, oh, that's too bad, or whatever that happens. But for our protagonist, Kathy, it really feels like part of her world has been lost. This sort of safe place that she grew up in, where she's had all these connections and memories and experiences, is no longer exists. It's just gone. But anyways, Miss Emily explains the whole thing, where in this world, like I said, clones have no rights. They are not seen as humans at all. And why not? Because it's just more convenient to assume that they don't, because then they can use their organs, and this is basically cured cancer. Because if you have cancer, they just cut the cancer out and stick another organ in from some clone. But the Hailsham project was one that it was sort of a human rights project to sort of prove that these clones were just as human as anyone else. So that's why they raised them and taught them and filled them full of culture and art and had them create. And this art that they collected was put in galleries to sort of show off that, hey, this was made by clones. See, they're just as good as anything that a normal human can create. But this sort of fell apart when they briefly mentioned this guy who was involved in eugenics, and he wanted to clone sort of the next generation of children to be superior to the past generation, and that sort of made people really nervous about clones and felt like they're going to replace them or something. And so the whole Hailsham project just fell apart. All the donors left, and without money, it ran underground. It fell apart. And so this whole thing about deferrals was just a rumor. And Miss Emily explains that the rumor cropped up again and again. She would squash it, but it just would spontaneously come up. It wasn't a continuous rumor passed on and on. It would just naturally, people would get this idea in their heads that if I can prove I'm in love with someone, I will be granted a few more years of life. But she reveals this is not the case. And of course, they don't take this very well. So they leave, they pull over on the drive home. Tommy gets out and has a big fit, and Kathy goes and holds him tight. And yeah, they go back to the clinic, drop Tommy off, and Tommy sort of accepts the truth and accepts his own mortality and recognizes that he doesn't have much time left. And so when the next notice for his fourth donation comes up, which the fourth is kind of like the last one, I don't know what order they go in, but when you're losing your fourth organ, it's kind of the end. It's never explained what organs they take, but it's like, I assume kidney you can go along with. I don't know what else they take from you, but whatever the fourth one is, that's the big one. And so he tells Kathy, like, I'm going to get a new carer. I don't want you to be here with me when the end comes. And yeah, so that's what happens. The book ends with Kathy telling the story that she sort of went off and heard later that Tommy had completed. Now she's nearing the end of her time as a carer. So this has all happened years in the past. She's been a carer for 14 years now. She's 31, and she's sort of exhausted and looking forward to sort of her retirement, which is becoming a donor herself. And yeah, that's sort of the tragedy of the book. It's not so much that these people are dying so young, because remember, to them that's sort of a normal lifespan. The tragedy is this missed opportunity of these two people who had been sort of crushing on one another when they were preteens and in love, but not really sharing that love with each other because of Ruth getting in the way. And so sort of catching up in their old age, but not able to make up for lost time. Yeah, that's my first book by Kazuo Ishiguro. It was good, but it didn't really hit me or I didn't really enjoy myself in the world or in the prose as much as some other books. Not saying it's bad, I just don't know if he's the writer for me. But I would give him another chance if there's another book of his that is different. But yeah, anyways, that was Never Let Me Go.